on Let It Rip.
Sit to the side of that door and do everything you possibly can to stop it from being open. You can also put as many barricade items as you can in front of that door.
Keeping kids safe in the classroom. Just this week in Macomb County, a 10-year-old brings a knife to school along with a hit list. This 1 year after the Oxford school shooting. So what else needs to happen to keep a gunman or danger out of the classroom?
What do we do when a student is in that sort of crisis to support that student mentally so they may not indeed manifest in that way?
We try to dig up some answers that every parent needs to hear. But first,
making a terrorist threat is an adult activity, and you're going to be treated like an adult.
Adult actions mean adult consequences. The message is out there, but still the school threats continue. One prosecutor says to fix the problem, hit the parents where it hurts the most. But will fining mom and dad stop kids from these daily dangerous distractions? And so let's start right there. We may not all land on the same solution, but we all want one thing: to keep kids safe at school. And that has to start by stopping these threats. But how? Macomb County Prosecutor Pete Lucido is with us. He has an idea, and it means fining some of the parents. But will that work? Also with us today, former Madison High School Superintendent Dr. Randy Speck. He's an expert who continues his leadership in the world of education. He also is an Oxford parent who knows some of the victims' families well. And our anchor attorney, Charlie Langton, is also with us today. Charlie's been covering the tragedy in Oxford since it happened last year. And let's start with Dr. Speck. You know one of the families. When you hear about the missed signs, first of all, when it comes to what we saw happen with that shooter in Oxford, the thoughts that have to go through your mind as someone who lives in that community, anger, and I'm sure a sense of, you just kind of throw your hands up in the air.
Yeah, you do. I mean, as a school administrator, you think through the policies, you think through the active shooter trainings, you think through all the things that you do as a school leader and that you have your folks do within your schools. But every day I drop my daughter off at school. And Oxford, as a school community and as a high school, it's got some of the best technology in the world. But I still drop my daughter off. She still walks through those doors, and you worry. You worry every day. I just saw a research from the Pew Research Group that not too long ago that said 1/3 of our parents in this country are worried about their kids' safety when they go to school. That could be low. That could be I don't know. But it's, as a parent, I worry every day. And my daughter, when she goes to school, even though she knows she's going into a safe place, sure, at least she believes, if she finds out that there's a threat coming in, she doesn't want to go to school.
Who would want to go to school feeling in this environment after hearing about what happened in Oxford, hearing about a threat like this? We're seeing so many threats. By the way, just some numbers for you. 42 school shootings in 2021, 42, 24 this year so far. And yet we want our young people to go to school and feel safe. Pete Lucido, enough is enough.
Enough is enough. But to the doctor's point, we have policies that are in place in every school that says zero tolerance on weapons, zero tolerance as it relates to bullying, zero tolerance as it relates to threats. Yet those policies from the board that is put into place by the citizens who elect their board members to the school board, it doesn't seem to be working. And it's not the teachers or the administrators that teach the lesson at home, which is being respectful and not doing these things. So the teachers have enough weight on them as it is, as a result of teaching them what tools they need to get a life afterwards.
So you have an idea, and your idea is let's find mom and dad. Let me get to this in a moment. Today, we just learned about this 10-year-old child in Macomb County who brought with him to school a knife, yep, and had a hit list because he didn't like the way he was being bullied. He asked another student to hold down another student so he could use this knife and potentially kill him. How would your policy of finding a mom and dad prevent something like that from happening?
So in this case, we had limited resources because it was derailed immediately. But when you have these threats of a bomb or any of that, where you're deploying police, fire, and even DPW, if you've got to go ahead and put the barricades around the school, who's paying for that? The city, the township, or the village that deploy these resources. And what does that do for the rest of the community that is not misbehaving and not breaking the law? They lose out on those resources, and it could be an ambulance that's needed for my mother or your mother, Roop. And as a result, What is it that we're trying to accomplish here? So restitution has always been in the books for a family or a parent who's raising a minor child to pay the restitution for deploying those assets and not having the benefit of those assets for the community that didn't break the law.
What would these fines look like? So let's just say someone calls
When you
in a
say
threat.
fines, it's restitution. So we want to be
you
clear.
find the kid who made the threat, right? And now you're going to tell mom and dad you have to pay the restitution.
Yeah.
How will this actually unfold?
So what they do right now on drunk driving, they look at the officer's time, they look at how much, if there was a tow truck involved, that's paid separately. If you're brought into the station and it takes 2 hours of the police officer's time, it's very easy to calculate. If we have 6 police officers out there, 2 EMS drivers, because let's face it, a threat is a threat, and it can't be taken idle, as the doctor knows, because they have to follow up on it for the safety of the students that the parents believe are going to be safe in a school. When is it going to stop? What ideas? We have the hero. Be a
That's
hero.
going to prevent these things. We've got
Charlie,
laws
it
in the
happened-
books. Murder is against the law since forever, and yet there are murders every single day. Now what you're going to do is going to make the parents pay, and suppose they can't pay. And I'm going to challenge your restitution. I want to know that. You better hire some more prosecutors. You better get your county board together, get more prosecutors there, because there's going to be a lot of hearings. How many do we have? These school threats every single day.
Charlie, the hero
It starts
program
at
worked.
home.
It just worked in this case.
Let's talk to Rand.
It was somebody who
let's talk to
sees
Dr.
something,
Speck.
say something, and did something.
Dr. Speck, do you think paying restitution is the answer?
Well,
here?
I'm wondering if restitution could be paid in a different way. So maybe maybe it's not money. Maybe it's through some classes. Maybe it's through some parenting. We talk about things happening at home. Parents, whether in low-income or upper-income families, don't necessarily know how to talk to their kids. Now, I'm fortunate. I've got 2 great kids. We have great conversations.
So you're not going to be paying then, are you?
Well, I think there's other ways to do the restitution. What if we're having conversations with parents about warning signs to be able to recognize within your family? It's hard enough to think that my child is going to do something, and just get sent to the principal's office, much less do something that's violent and it's going to actually harm somebody. You've moved into another category at that place.
But Dr. Speck, let's be frank about the kids that we're seeing doing these types of things. The shooter in Oxford. You look at what his mom and dad allegedly were doing and not doing, looking at warning signs and not looking at warning signs. It's those parents that we have to be worried about, not parents like you who have a good relationship with their kids, right?
Yeah, well, it literally is the entire community, right? It's the entire community. Public education, our schools are for all. We don't get to say some can come in and some can't come in. You're a bad parent, your child can't come in. They're all coming in. So we have to find ways, whether it's through actual monetary fines or through some type of empowerment for our parents.
What's wrong with putting the kid in a juvenile home for a couple of days, maybe a week?
Well, you got costs with
We're doing it
that.
right now. Hold on a minute,
Do
Charlie.
it.
Charlie, we're doing it right now because I will not let a juvenile out that has done something like that, meaning we are going to zealously advocate to say, get a psychologist, get somebody who's qualified and trained to see what made this student, or in this case, a 10-year-old child, bring a knife to school and have a hit list.
So
what caused that type of behavior?
But does another 10-year-old who's watching television or hear from their parents at the dinner table that little Johnny went to juvie, does that stop that kid from making a threat the next day?
No, because it's got to be personal. It has to be owned by that child. It has to be owned by that family. The responsibility isn't Mr. Lucido, it's not the government. The responsibility is within the home. We have spent in the last 20 years $3 billion on school security. $3 billion throughout this country.
And what do we have to show for that?
We have 346 school shootings since Columbine. We have over 400 people who've been injured, and we have almost 200 people who've been killed during that period of time.
Dr. Speck, what's a solution that no one's talking about?
Well, it is building relationships with families, that sometimes feels like that'll take forever, and that's feeling, and that's touchy feeling, all this. We have to have a model where we have kids who are connected to their schools. They believe that they're loved and cared for by teachers. But here's the other thing when we talk about this. It used to be where our teachers, they just taught math, science, social studies, and English. Now we are a catch-all for everything that's happening within our schools. but we're having to take that responsibility. So when schools have the opportunity to be better connected to the home and the families can feel more comfortable, there are outliers that happen all the time. You see it, Sheriff Bouchard sees it, we see it all the time. But for the whole, when we're building opportunities to be more connected to our families, we will see better things happen.
Charlie, you've been covering this for a while. You build a system that feels like maybe people are talking to their kids, and for the most part, you have a solid system, but then you have a breach. How do you stop the outlier?
Well, I think you probably need a cop in every school. If a school doesn't have a cop, I think the cop has to be, part of the job is to be a community resource person. I think we have to teach people respect for police officers. I think we have to teach people respect for each other. Yes. And I think we have to instill in them at kindergarten that they don't bring knives to school. Here's a knife, everybody. You bring it to school, you're going to go here. Let's take a field trip. Let's take a field trip to juvenile. What's wrong with that?
But part of that
problem wrong. Take them there and lock them up for a little while.
There's no.
And we'll talk. What do you think? That will get their attention.
Dr. Speck,
there's no solid information. There are 14 million kids in this country.
You want to study? I spend another $3 million. You're spending too much money. Don't lock them up. Take them to the juvenile home and let them see what life is like.
There's not great information or research that says if we put cops in schools, it's going to make kids feel safer. There's just not.
We have liaison officers at almost every school in Macomb County. We're the second largest school district in the state of Michigan. And last but not least, students have to empower themselves in that school, and if you see something, you say something. And the reason why is, Roop, that's for their own safety, the benefit of the safety of the other students. And if it's not going to work that way, then it will never work, because this is the time that the students said, this is our class, it's not yours to take advantage of us.
Dr. Speck, you come from a very unique leadership position, being a former superintendent, a leader in education right now, but you're a dad.
Yeah.
And your kids go to Oxford. When you heard a little bit about what was missed by whomever, allegedly missed by these administrators, these leaders, the board, whatever it was, where are the biggest holes to you when you look at what happened in Oxford?
I mean, that's tough because that's personal, right? That's a personal situation. These are folks who are friends of mine in that community, but at the same time, they knew they had policies in place, and it is the job of the board to make sure that those things are being implemented. And school administrators, I don't know of a school administrator who doesn't want to have a safe school. I don't know of a teacher who doesn't want to have a safe classroom and a safe environment. And things get missed along the way, and that tragedy happened, and it has ripped and hurt our community terribly up there.
Final question to Pete Lucido. You hear about people saying, arm these teachers, give guns to the teachers that want them in school. Do you support that?
No, not at all. I do not support showing violence by a teacher who's supposed to be emulated by way of example. The reality is the students in the school have to take an active part, do their job too. Parents, more importantly, when you're at home with your child, put the cell phones away, or at least limit the cell phones to only calls back to you, mom and dad, and take out the social media and the component of making threats. You can limit those phones. You have access to put the apps on it that you want and what you don't want, and police your children to see what's going on.
Less time on TikTok and more time at the dinner
Absolutely,
table.
Ruth.
Dr. Speck, we have about 30 seconds left.
He's
Go
on
ahead.
TikTok every day.
I know he's on TikTok.
I think
he got more followers than you
he
have.
definitely does.
I think students, to Mr. Lucido's point, I think when students start to have a voice, an agency about their school, and they own it, they've got buy-in, I think we're going to start to see them feel safer, and we'll have safer schools.
Dr. Randy Speck, Pete Lucido, good to see you both. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about exactly what we can do, how to prevent school shootings, and what needs to be done to make sure kids are safe if a shooter does come in. We tackle that with Sheriff Michael Bouchard and a local school superintendent. Welcome back to Let It Rip. Tonight, two leaders who've been working for years to make sure schools remain safe. Joining us now, Oakland County Sheriff Mike Bouchard. He's helped countless businesses and schools with active shooter training. He never wanted to be so close to an actual mass shooting. That changed, of course, a year ago in Oxford. Sheriff Bouchard, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us with some ideas on what we can do to try to prevent a future school shooting. Also joining us, Dr. R.J. Weber. He's the superintendent of schools in Northville. He's been a leader who has really stepped up in front of the topic of school safety. safety. He has some ideas on what we need to do to keep kids safe, and our anchor attorney Charlie Langton is of course with us as well. Let's begin with the sheriff for a moment. Sheriff Bouchard, first of all, I know this has been a tough week for everyone involved with what happened in Oxford, for the entire community, but your men and women went into that school 1 year ago. A year later, do you think we feel safer than we were a year ago in schools across Metro Detroit?
Well, I think in some ways we are safer, but in some ways we feel less safe because it became a reality to people in this community. It was always abstract, and now it's real. So I think it's much more tangible. So when a threat comes in, they're much more fearful because they've seen a real thing play out and how tragic and terrible it was.
Dr. Weber, when you take a look at what happened in Oxford and you feel the ripple effects out in Northville, we're all part of the same community here in Metro Detroit. How have things changed for you in terms of leadership?
Well, in the education community in general, really our whole world changed with Columbine. From that point on, as a former high school principal and so on, our heads were on a swivel. We were always anticipating, unfortunately, those pieces. As the sheriff said very well, when it is closer to home like that, it certainly sharpens the senses of our communities.
When you take a look at some of the solutions being talked about by, for instance, Macomb County Prosecutor Pete Lucido, he says, fine mom and dad with restitution. When you hear things like that, does any of that click and say, yeah, that sounds right, Sheriff Bouchard?
You know, I think that's a reasonable discussion to be had because a lot of the false threats, and I want to make it clear, a false threat's still a crime. So, you know, anybody that considers making a threat, understand it's going to be investigated, and it is a crime whether or not you intend to carry it out. So we're going to investigate 100% of those and present those to the prosecutor. We had 3 yesterday. We arrested 1 student, removed the other 2 from school, and action are pending. So there's consequences regardless of intent to go to the next step. But I would say it's something that parents need to have that conversation with their kids to let them know 2 things. If they see or hear something that makes them afraid, they have to share it, and make sure they understand that there is no joke about making a threat and there is real consequences. And if they've done that and a student still does that, then it might be a different story. But if they haven't taken the educational steps to talk to their kids and make sure their kids understand the serious nature of this, I think it's a discussion about compensation because it draws tremendous amount of resources for us to investigate on average 1 to 5 threats a day for just us.
Dr. Weber, does that help, you think, to charge a parent?
You know, I think accountability is critical for everybody. You know, I myself am a gun owner. My weapons are secured, and I really cannot fathom in any way, shape, or form how people would shirk the responsibility to manage that and to do it well, and why anyone would fear accountability for that. But on my end of it, what I would argue is that what we need is to really truly attend to the real mental health issues that are facing us. Frankly, I am sick and tired of hearing people say we love our kids, we love our teachers, but then what do we do? What do we do? The sheriff is exactly right. I see what law enforcement goes through when they have to do these pieces, the resources, the time, the energy, dispatching detectives to people's houses at 2 o'clock in the morning to go knock on the door because you have a tip on that from OK to Say. In the state of Michigan, Roop, 10 years ago, we had 4,500 people completing their teacher ed programs. 10 years later, we have half that. To be a licensed counselor or social worker in the state of Michigan, you have to get a master's degree. Well, getting that master's degree, you have to do 500 to 600 hours of clinical work to get that. So my argument would be if people and politicians are going to say what we need to do is to support our families and kids and to support law enforcement, frankly, because that's an extension that would, I would argue that we need to be much bolder and do things like pay for master's degrees for people going into counseling in social work in the schools, perhaps put a 5-year agreement on there that they have to serve in a public school for 5 years to do that. But my friends and brothers and sisters in law enforcement and public education are breaking. It is too much. No threat is too small to investigate. You know that.
Absolutely.
And I can't even imagine the hours that your team puts into that. Yep. And we lose entire days of school. You know, my principals have to spend a day investigating the smallest threat.
A false threat. Yeah, Charlie?
I still think that there is I wish we had more respect for police officers, because I'll say it again, I think we need a police officer in every school, and that person would be in charge with instructing kids on what the law is, what are the consequences, and I do think we need to take kids to the children's village or the juvenile detention area, whatever county it is, and I think we got to be a little hard on them. Not in a bad way, but in a respectful way. I think the cops that are out there have a terrible job. They don't know if there's going to be a mass shooting. They just don't know that.
Well,
Dr. Weber,
Dr.
Weber, you were shaking your head at the
Yeah, I'm
cop in
shaking
every
my head
school.
because
Why?
Charlie, all right, so if this notion of somehow scared straight works so
Yes.
well, then can you explain to me, Charlie, why states that have the death penalty still have people,
I'm not saying the death penalty for
right,
these
who
kids.
go ahead and still commit the crime? Because if
You-
your
you-
belief,
that murder's
if
been
your
on the
belief
books
is that's what
forever.
we do, that what we do is we
Yeah.
scare people enough, how about we support them? How about that law enforcement, you don't put an SRO and expect an SRO to do everything. How about we as a society collectively say, we need to, instead of just talking about what we're going to do to support law enforcement, and say we love our police or we love our
I just
teachers.
did. I just said it.
Yeah, you said it, but what are we
Police-
going to
Yeah,
do to
put
give them the
what-
resources?
You have to pay for it.
How?
A millage? But listen, believe me, there are people all over there that would love this job. This is a good job.
It's a great
to be
job.
the head of a school security guard.
It's a great job.
to
But
teach
let's
kids?
talk about what
Oh
this,
my
from
gosh,
a law
it'd be great.
enforcement
One person, though.
perspective. From a law enforcement perspective, what does this look like to have an officer in every school, and how, for instance, does that prevent what happened in Macomb County today with a 10-year-old bringing a knife in a backpack? Would a cop stop that if they had one cop for the whole school? Sheriff Bouchard.
Well, I think it's great to have more police in schools because it builds relationships with kids. They understand that we're there to help and that we're a resource. They're not afraid of a uniform because they see us in a non-threatening in a police environment. I think that's good long-term for society. And then having a person there that understands what to do in an emergency and how to react is also good. If that terrible tragedy visits that door, somebody's there and prepared. Would it be expensive? Absolutely, but we have it at every courthouse, and at every airport, at every Capitol building. So we protect pretty much all levels of government except our kids.
Every
So-
pilot in a plane, in a cockpit. But let me ask you something about Ethan Crumbley, the shooter in the Oxford case. And I'm sorry to make this comparison, but what happened that potentially could have been a deadly attack in Macomb County with a 10-year-old bringing a knife in. How would a police officer in a school prevent any of what happened from actually taking place?
Well, it depends on each school district can set their own protocol. So some districts have metal detectors, some districts have clear backpacks, some districts have process where they check in and they open their backpack. So there's ways, and you have to make an individual decision as a school district what makes sense. Where is the balance, right? And so there are ways to prevent items from coming in, but it's not just that, because some very secure and lockdown buildings, the weakest link is always the weakest link. If somebody leaves a door propped open, and oftentimes the door by an athletic facility going out to the practice field is propped open so kids come in and out. Somebody knows that, they come in that door, they avoid all the other process. So you have to have everybody working together, working to make sure if they see or hear something, because my guess is that kid probably said something to someone before that happened. And that's where the link is. We had a 6-year-old come to dinner one night and tell his parents another 6-year-old said they were going to bring a gun to school. And instead of the parents going, I'm sure, it's a terrible thing to say, but I'm sure he didn't mean it, and dismissing it, they looped us in. We looped into schools. We were at the school the next morning, and we took a gun out of a backpack before he got into school
Chain
of a
of information.
6-year-old.
Chain of information. Before we go to break here, Dr. Weber, I wanted to ask you, arming teachers with a non-lethal weapon, bear spray, a paint gun, to distract or disrupt an active shooter from coming in. That's an idea that's being tossed around across the country. Do you support that?
I do not.
Why?
I believe that appropriate training and deep training is really, if you look at Oxford and what happened in that tragedy, those hallways cleared out like that. And why did they clear out like that? Because in conjunction with law enforcement, with proper training, the kids knew what to do. Doing and training everybody in a system, working with law enforcement, having a great relationship with SROs is, in my opinion, a technical thing that will save lives. But before you kick me off, I'm going to say it again. We need to put the resources forth that we care about. And you said something that was beautiful right there. We put people to protect judges and so on. Where don't we put people to protect? And you said our kids. So thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it.
We have some time for final thoughts. We're going to get to those right after this. Stay with us. Final thoughts, Dr. Weber.
I just appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to say thank you simply to law enforcement, to parents. The OK to Say that the state of Michigan has rolled out has actually been exceptionally effective. And really the key is communication, communication, communication. Listen to your kids. Thank you.
Thank you for the work that you do, Dr. Weber. Sheriff Bouchard.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to the community for their support, not just of Oxford, but of law enforcement, of the whole community. It's a challenging time. Reach out to each other, help each other. A lot of people are struggling, not just with this, but with a lot of issues, but this has really magnified it and been terrible. So it takes courage to ask for help, and people want to help you, so do that. We're all here to help you 24/7. We think about this every day.
We cover this every day, but the real work is being done by people just like both of you, and we thank you both for the work that you've been doing, and thanks for keeping us all safe and educated. That does it for this edition of Let It Rip.